But we're going to go ahead and dive in. Thank you again, everyone who's joined us. My name is Subin DeVar, and before we dig in, I want to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the ancestral lands of the Piscataway and Anacostan peoples, what is now known as Washington, D.C. And for countless generations, indigenous peoples have stewarded this land that I and my family live on, and so I want to honor them. And thank you all for calling in, wherever you're calling in from. I'm the co-founder and co-director of the Initiative for Energy Justice, which is a national research center that provides law and policy resources to advocates and policymakers to advance state-level transitions to equitable renewable energy. So we're so delighted to have you join us today. I'm here with Shalanda Baker, who needs no introduction since you're all here to hear her talk about her book. But if you'll allow me to introduce my colleague, my friend, and longtime partner in good trouble, please bear with me. We'll be much less formal after this, but I do want to just take a minute to read her bio to do it justice. So Shalanda Baker is a professor of law, public policy, and urban affairs at Northeastern University. She has spent more than a decade conducting research on the equity dimensions of the global transition away from fossil fuel energy to cleaner energy resources. She teaches courses on renewable energy development, energy justice, and environmental law. In 2015, she was awarded a Fulbright grant to explore Mexico's energy reform, climate change, and indigenous rights. She is the co-founder and co-director of the Initiative for Energy Justice. Professor Baker is the author of over a dozen articles, book chapters, and essays on renewable energy law, policy, and development. Before joining Northeastern's faculty, Shalanda spent 3 years as an associate professor of law at the William S. Richardson School of Law, University of Hawaii, where she was the founding director of the Energy Justice Program. Prior to that, she served on the faculty at the University of San Francisco School of Law. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in political science from the United States Air Force Academy, a Juris Doctor from Northeastern University School of Law, and an LLM from the University of Wisconsin School of Law, where she also served as a William H. Hastie Fellow. After law school, before working as a corporate and project finance attorney in both the Boston and Tokyo offices of the law firm Bingham McCutcheon, Shalanda clerked for the Associate Justice Roderick Ireland of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. Shalanda is also a veteran and former Air Force officer who fought to end the military's don't ask, don't tell policy. She also serves on the Massachusetts Energy Facilities Siting Board, the Massachusetts Global Warming Solutions Act Implementation Advisory Committee Climate Justice Working Group, the board of the Solutions Project, the board of Solstice Solar, and the board of Clean Energy Group. So with that introduction, Shalanda, I'd like to start our conversation with a line from your book that really sums things up for me. It goes like this. This book argues that energy policy should be the domain where we fight for the next generation of civil rights. What does that mean to you? What is this book about? And how does it speak to where we are right now?
Oh my gosh. So before I get into the meat of, my remarks in this discussion, I also want to first acknowledge that I am dialing in to all of you who are dialing in from places like Hawaii and South Africa. Thank you so much for being here. I am dialing in from territory that was taken from the Nipmuc people and the Wampanoag people, who are the people of the first light. And it is my hope that my work speaks to their ongoing struggle for self-sovereignty and self-governance. I also want to give a shout out to my mom, who I know is dialing in, as well as my partner, Tara Span, who is also dialing in. Their support in so many ways made this project possible. And so I'm just giving a lot of gratitude to them. And of course, some of you don't know all the people who have dialed in to say hello. Some folks only said hello to the panelists. So you don't know that there's just such a diverse group of folks who also supported this work. And so I'm just grateful for everyone for taking the time out of your day to hear about this project. So Subin, for me, this work really started way back in 2010. I had just left corporate law, and I spent a year practicing in Tokyo in 2008. And while I was there, I saw the world fall apart before our eyes. I got to Tokyo a week after Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy protection. It was the hottest year on record. It was also the year that our first Black president, President Barack Obama, was elected. And so it was this moment where there was both a tremendous possibility, but also the recognition that we needed a new system. We needed so many different types of systems, right? The climate emergency was becoming clear, as well as, there was a sort of opening where the new president sort of created this sense of optimism about the type of future that we create. So I quit my corporate law job. That's a long story, but essentially bought a one-way ticket to Mexico. And I found myself in a place called Oaxaca, which is the second poorest state in Mexico. It is also home to no fewer than 14 distinct indigenous groups that speak different indigenous languages. And while I was in Oaxaca, I sort of had this plan that I was going to make my way, through Latin America, work with indigenous peoples who are fighting against coal and oil and gas and other extractive industries. Mm-hmm. But what I found in Oaxaca was a group of indigenous peoples who were fighting against mega wind energy development. And literally, for lack of a better metaphor, an electric current went down my spine. In that moment, meeting these indigenous peoples who were fighting against clean energy development, I realized that so long as we were relying on the same logics, the same mechanisms, the same models and tools for the clean energy transition, we were going to replicate the inequality that is baked into our current fossil fuel-based energy system. And so that began the journey to write Revolutionary Power without my knowing it. That moment sort of set up this tension between the fight to mitigate climate change and avert catastrophic climate change, and social justice and issues of equity, indigenous rights, and other dimensions of structural inequality. And so from that place, I began to really question the dynamics, the tools, the mechanisms of development, as well as the mechanisms, laws, and policies of our energy transition. So yeah, that's kind of the origin story. And there are many, many reasons why I decided to write this book right now. Sort of transitioning away from Mexico, I landed in Hawaii. And I got to Hawaii in 2014 after teaching at the University of San Francisco. And I got to Hawaii during one of the most exciting times in that state's energy transition. It was sort of moving into a 100% clean energy future, and all of the same sort of dimensions and issues regarding equity were on the table. And so I knew that that was a moment to really begin to elevate these issues of equity in a much broader way.
Mm-hmm. And I want to come to many of those pieces. I'm excited to have this conversation. This for us is kind of wonderful because it's we have. For those you don't know, we talk to each other all the time. If you didn't piece it together in the intros, we're fellow co-founders and co-directors of IEJ and have known each other for a while. I want to dive in a little bit into some of what you just shared and ask you a little bit more, just a little bit more about why you wrote this story. Because for me, knowing you do a lot, and there's so much that we might juggle with the strategy and tactics of advancing energy justice. So why did you write this story from the perspective of anyone who's totally new to this area, but also someone who has been working in energy for a while? Why did you decide, with all that you had going on, why write this book?
Yeah, there was just such urgency. From what I was seeing, from where I sat, the world is being reshaped. There was this urgency around climate change and this need to bring more clean energy onto the grid and this need to sort of create resiliency. But there wasn't any attention being paid to those who have been the most impacted by the energy system. Mm. And so for me, there is a sense that that if we didn't bake equity into this transition, then we were going to sort of have to deal with it at the margins and likely fail at that. Mm-hmm. So to me, there was a sort of deep sense of justice and a calling really to write this book in this particular moment. And as you know, I couldn't have timed it better, right? I mean, this summer we saw a Black man who was murdered, lynched in public sight under the knee of a white police officer. And all of us flooded into the streets marching for Black lives, but we did not march for a more just energy system. But what I know, based on my work over the last decade, is that the energy system is implicated in the structural injustice and structural racism that we experience on a day-to-day basis. And it too should be a part of this broader discussion concerning racial justice. And so the timing of this book for me is really apt. Again, it really felt like a calling. I had other projects that I was thinking that would come out earlier. I mean, I had a book on Mexico that was in my mind being ready to be written. But this is the one that was just sort of like, write this. And again, the timing couldn't have been more apt.
Well, I think you're right. I think that's one of the things that stood out to me as I was reading the book, just this gratitude that you wrote it and that it's here now. You know, one of the things that it made me think about is how you made my life easier in terms of this book being out there. And I have my own ideas of who I think it would be great to read the book, but I'm wondering for you, who do you feel this book is for? Who do you wishes reads this book?
Yeah. So, as you know, Subin, we work with policymakers, we work with frontline leaders. So we work with folks who come from environmental justice communities. We work with academics in this space through the initiative. And this book is absolutely meant for all of those people, right? It's meant to sort of elevate the stakes of our transition and inject and provoke around issues of equity. But it's also meant for my mom. It's meant for your mom, right? And it's meant for students to sort of dive into and really begin to understand that that the stakes of this transition are so high. And it's eminently possible to make equity a part of our transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy. So it's for everybody. It's a kitchen table book.
Right. And I think one of the things that was unique about the book is how both personal and technical it was, in a way that, I don't think I've read something quite like this. And I wanted to ask a bit more about that. So it is personal. You include stories of your own life that really give texture to both who you are and why you're grappling with these questions, but they also help us think about the specific technical challenges and solutions. Why'd you write the book in such a way that it was quite vulnerable? Like, how was that for you? What did it feel like to be that honest with basically anyone who picks up this book and learns a bit more about you?
Yeah, so I think that in some ways that's the most radical aspect of the book. I've described the book as, part memoir, part policy guide, part love letter to the planet. And when I started the process, I really started in on the technical, right? I've written a lot of articles, a lot of chapters about energy, the energy system and about the energy transition. And I sort of thought, okay, I'm going to enter by, talking about the technical. And it really wasn't landing for me. It felt hollow and it was boring. And I was just like, I'm never going to get through this book if I'm talking about the utility system and all of these things without bringing them to life. And so the first line of the book, the introduction, is I have to start at the beginning. And I really needed to write to try to determine why I have a stake in this. Why me? A Black woman from Texas, a queer woman, someone who is sort of an unlikely lawyer, unlikely advocate, unlikely law professor. Why me to tell this story? What is it about my journey that is worth elevating? And it wasn't sort of self-referential. I mean, it really was about who are the people on whose shoulders I stand? What is it about my unique lived experience that gives me a different lens and being able to tell this? And as you know, I start the book by talking about Port Arthur and talking about my dad and his family. And Port Arthur is a place that is both the birthplace as well as the spine of the modern fossil fuel industry. It is a poor Latinx and Black community that is so reliant on the fossil fuel system, but also being killed and poisoned by it. So for those in the audience, I mean, before the calls to shelter in place were common to all of us, people in that particular part of the country were called to shelter in place because the air was too toxic. And that is, I mean, it is an area that is dense with fossil fuel development, dense with petrochemical development, and it is a sacrifice zone, as we would say in the environmental justice community. So that place, in many ways, is being sacrificed in order to fuel the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And so this was the entry point, you know, really digging back deep into my roots. And then it's funny that the other bookend to this story is my own story, my mom's story, raising us as a single parent, you know, really kind of teetering on the brink of poverty, you know, middle class, like sort of always back and forth, but who couldn't get, you know, government assistance to make sure that we could have a warm home. And so this is an energy insecurity issue. And so I realized that I had a stake in the story that I wanted to tell. And sort of the meat of the book is about Hawaii. The meat of the book is about California and Puerto Rico and all of the places that I've been, where there are people living through the implications of the energy system and the implications of the energy policy. And the last thing I'll say, Subin, is that none of this is accidental, right? The ways in which people are marginalized vis-a-vis the energy system are deliberate policy choices. And so what that means is that we can make different choices. And so I absolutely have a stake in this. I wanted this book to come alive. I wanted this book to be about everyday people. And I hope I accomplished that. It's not your father's energy policy book. It is absolutely just a labor of love and a showing of love.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think there's also something about this moment that makes this story and the connection to people's stories around the country quite unique. It's not a new story, as you've said, for so many folks. But in some ways, things have changed dramatically in the last few years. So 20 or 30 years ago, as the environmental justice movement was growing and, you know, outsized impact and influence for the number of leaders that were really taking up that call, but it was still it wasn't common knowledge for people to grapple with the sort of challenges that the environmental justice community was raising. Whereas fast forward to the stories that you mentioned in the book with Hurricane Harvey, my family is in Houston. The various hurricanes, the wildfires, almost everyone probably called in has been somewhat touched by, connected to some disaster or another that's really bringing these stories, unfortunately, to life. But before we turn into some of the specific areas of energy policy that you focus on, I want to ask one last question. You know, you mentioned you're sharing a lot of stories about Hawaii. A lot of the story centers there. What is talking about Hawaii tell us? How does that help us think about folks who live, you know, anywhere else in the U.S. and U.S. territories?
Yeah, so I mean, in many ways, Hawaii is a unique place, right? It's one of the most remote places on Earth. It's in the middle of the Pacific, but it is a fascinating place with respect to energy policy. So again, I got there in 2014, just as the state was grappling with its own energy transition. You know, one of the hot topics there was the limits of rooftop solar and who would continue to have access to rooftop solar. Back then, Hawaii had a 17% penetration of rooftop solar. And that means almost 1 in 5 residents had solar panels on the rooftops. I mean, that is extraordinary. It was the highest rate in the country at that point. And the utility was pushing back vociferously against it, right? Saying that a number of things, but saying that the technical limits of the grid could no longer support rooftop solar. We needed a new way. Hawaii is also on the front lines of climate change. I mean, sea level rise, all of the things that are sort of becoming more and more an everyday occurrence were happening in Hawaii in a very real way. And so issues of resilience, what would happen when the lights went out? What would happen when, a massive climate related event kind of shut off the centralized grid? And so that was a part of the discourse then. Hawaii was also grappling with the nature of its utility and whether or not the predominant model, which you and I know is the investor-owned utility model, was the best model to move the state from its fossil fuel-based system to a clean energy system. Of course, the investor-owned utility model has its own incentives, which in many ways are contradictory to a just transition. They want to sell more electricity. They want to put in more energy infrastructure that may or may not be useful. And so all of that was playing out in Hawaii. And so while I was there, what I realized was that, oh my gosh, we have a preview to what everyone else around the country is going to face in the next 5 or 10 years. And so I dove in to energy policy. And I have to say, as someone who sort of had written a lot about theory and indigenous rights, I was loath to engage in regulatory proceedings. I mean, I avoided them like the plague. And I was just like, I'm not doing this. I'm not going into regulatory proceedings. But that is where the rubber hit the road. And that's where a lot of the technical aspects and decisions about the energy system were being meted out and playing out. And so I was paying attention to regulatory proceedings, but I was also interviewing so many stakeholders, dozens and dozens of stakeholders in Hawaii. I talked to regulators. I talked to solar industry representatives and executives. I talked to executives from the utility. I also talked to big green organizations, so mainstream environmental organizations, as well as frontline organizations. So those who are representing Native Hawaiians, those who are representing, people of color in the more traditional civil rights struggles. And in every single conversation, what became apparent to me when I asked, okay, so where do communities fit into this conversation? How do we ensure that equity is a central part of this debate? Literally, I would either get shut out of the room or sort of, iced. And people would look at me like, please don't mention this because we're so busy worrying about clean energy. We need more clean energy on the grid. Or they would say, the transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy is purely technical. If we can figure out how to do the fuel switch, then we're good. And we can worry about issues of equity later, right? And so again, this is so animating for me. This was the moment when I realized there's a story to be told here. Yeah. I saw even then, and I continue to see now, that this transition is a mechanism for broader structural transformation among so many dimensions of our society. And so that's why Hawaii, right? That's why I focus so much on that place, because it is a preview of what we will see around the country over the next decade.
I want to go further into that debate that you sort of started to lay out. And as I turn, I want to just share with folks watching, we do have a Q&A feature in the webinar. I've got tons of questions, so I'm going to keep going, but I'm going to try to weave in your questions as possible. So, please share, and apologies again if we don't get to them. But one of the questions that came up actually, gets right to one of the things I was going to ask. I recently saw your book was reviewed in the Sierra Club magazine, which was really exciting, both for it to be given that attention, but also the nuanced and positive light in which it talked about the book. It made me think about the variety of perspectives and particularly the chapter in your book on climate change fundamentalism. So I have another question there, but I wanted to start with asking if you could share, first of all, what does that term mean, climate change fundamentalism?
Sure. So climate change fundamentalism is a term that I came up with after having witnessed this very narrow focus on mitigating climate change and reducing CO2 emissions. And we see that a lot in the sort of environmental community. We see it as well, with those who are sort of trying to advance this, this transition. And it sets up a dynamic that's very similar to the one we saw in the 70s and 80s. So in the 70s, we had sort of a watershed moment with respect to environmental law and policy. It's often referred to as the golden decade from 1970 to 1980, where we saw bipartisan agreement that we needed to steward the environment. And we saw all sorts of legislation being passed at the federal level to protect the environment. And so we emerged from that period into the 1980s when communities of color realized, wait, we have not been on the good receiving end of these policies, laws and policies. These laws have not benefited us in any real way. And so thus emerged the environmental justice movement, which was very much a response to the environmental gains of the 1970s. And so we're seeing a similar dynamic play out now where we are making strides. We actually are making strides despite the last 4 years. We are making strides on clean energy deployment. The cost of solar is going down, but I think communities of color are starting to realize that they have not benefited uniformly from this sea change, this opportunity that we now face. And so it's setting up a very similar dynamic. And climate change fundamentalism is very much, the reflection that we cannot, it's a pejorative term, that we cannot move forward in this transition without paying attention to issues of equity. We can't have blinders on, essentially, in our policymaking sphere. And I think policymakers in places like New York and places like California are beginning to grapple with that. Again, going back to my Hawaii example, equity wasn't on the table. It simply wasn't a part of the discourse. So it very much was a fundamentalist type of view of climate change mitigation. Yeah. And so going back to your Sierra Club example, for me, that review just warmed my heart. It was glowing, it was favorable. And it meant to me that the organizations that have been sort of advancing a justice blind approach to the transition are now realizing that we need alliances. Mm-hmm. We need relationships between the folks that you and I work with on a day-to-day basis and the organizations that are incredibly well resourced, right? Mm-hmm. Organizations like the Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, Environmental Defense Fund. These are organizations that came out of the 1970s and are now still key players in this moment. And they have millions and millions of dollars at their disposal to advance clean energy legislation and climate change legislation. Mm-hmm. But they have a duty to use those resources and that pulpit to bring communities along. And that says nothing about how our partners in the financing industry and also in the philanthropic world need to address these issues by actually funding the organizations on the ground who are doing the work.
Yeah. And I think this relates to a question that got asked that where I wanted to go. I think you recognize in the book the variety of different mainstream environmental organizations, and you touched on now where the conversation is shifting. These organizations aren't monolithic, and we know that, and they're making this shift, at least particularly in their discourse at a national level, in public relations, to increasingly recognize their concern for racial and economic equity. What would you say, this is part me paraphrasing a question, combining my own, but what would you say to those mainstream environmental organizations or the big greens? What is the thing that they must do first in order to show up for historically marginalized communities and people of color?
Yeah, I would say the first thing to do is listen, right? We have organizations, we have a network that really sprang up from that activism of the 1970s and the 80s. So the environmental justice movement it was sort of the first environmental justice-oriented movement, but then we had the climate justice movement, which includes many of the same players and actors. And now we are fighting for energy justice and energy equity. So there is a broad base of people who are working on these issues. And so I think despite a lot of bad blood within the movement around these issues, we have to come together. And so I would say creating alliances, doing the healing work, coming together to be in conversation with those who are living it on the ground is, to me, one of the first steps that people need to take. And so there are many, many organizations from West Coast to East and in the South and in the North, and Native-led organizations where people are already doing this work. And so it's extending, the olive branch. And I'll give you an example of that. So about a year ago, a couple years ago, I wrote an article called Anti-Resilience. And this whole notion of critiquing big green organizations, so large white-led environmental organizations, is not a new one for me. I've kind of been beating this drum for a little while now, really realizing what an opportunity they have to shift the discourse and debate. And so I went after NRDC a little bit in this article. I went after Environmental Defense Fund. And someone from each organization contacted me recently to be in conversation. And so that's what it takes. And I'm open, I'm willing to have these discussions. And I think people are sort of realizing that we have so much work to do that we cannot continue to be divided. And so for me, that's the first step.
Yeah. Okay. Speaking about being divided and drawing some lines, you do go after one group quite strongly. They're not an advocate group. They're not like that, but a player in the system, utilities, particularly entrenched for-profit investor-owned utilities. And you grapple with a lot of in the chapter on utilities about structure and regulation. Could you just highlight for us, just to start, what's the nugget of what we're grappling with the utility structure and reform?
Okay, so Subin, I'm going to start with a story, right? Because, I like to tell stories. I'm chatty. So let's start with California, a place you know and love, and many people who've dialed in are in California. The largest utility in the state, and one of the largest utilities in the country, if not the largest utility in the country, Pacific Gas and Electric, along with the other investor-owned utilities in the state, have regulatory approval and legitimate authority to shut off the power preemptively if there is a perceived threat of wildfire, right? And so, they put together their report talking about the threat, et cetera. So we know that wildfires are an increasing threat in this climate change era, but the wildfire threat in California has been, obviously it's a big deal, but many of the most devastating wildfires have been attributed to PG&E and its own infrastructure and its failure to maintain its infrastructure. Let's unpack that. We are paying utilities to keep the lights on, which means we also pay for them to maintain their electric infrastructure. PG&E made deliberate choices not to maintain its infrastructure and instead to forego things like tree trimming and other sorts of maintenance with its millions of miles or hundreds of thousands of miles of electrical infrastructure around California, and instead essentially increase its return to its own shareholders. And so this is a fundamental perversion of the energy system and the electric system and the sector that we have relied on to keep the lights on. So imagine this, you're a low income ratepayer and PG&E has preemptively allowed or decided to cut off the lights during these summer months, these wildfire threats. And so you've now lost all of the food in your refrigerator. You've now lost access to medicine. If you're on a ventilator or other life-saving advice, you've also lost access to that. And there is no backstop. There is no sort of way for you to be cared for in this moment. You can't go to a friend's house. It's COVID. You can't, you don't have a battery, right? You can't go to a hotel and say, I will ride out this moment. And this is, again, by design. So I go after investor-owned utilities for two reasons. One, I think they have perverse incentives. So they're incentivized to sell electricity, which means that rooftop solar gets cut into, which means they're going to push against it, especially in communities that are now in line to get the benefits of rooftop solar. And I'm talking about low to moderate income folks. I go after utilities because investor-owned utilities in particular, because I think we've regulated them in a perverse way. We have not incentivized them to do the right thing. And so I think, I don't really have an answer in that chapter. But yeah, go ahead, tell me.
I was going to say, you do propose a lot of different approaches, which is very helpful, and I think a lot of folks will be anywhere in the spectrum of new to these ideas, have grappled them with them a lot. I was both excited and a little unsatisfied that you didn't just say this is the solution that we should go for. And so my question to you would be, why did you land where you did by teeing up the whole debate, the possible solutions, but not saying specifically, here's the solution, here's the structure that would resolve our problem about utility and its systematic design?
Well, so I'm seeing some questions in the chat about investor-owned utilities, as well as co-ops, municipal power providers. So I throw everything on the table. I'm very clear in that chapter that you're referencing on utility reform that, look, I don't like the IOU model. I think it's whack. I think we need to do better. But everything's on the table. So that means I think we need to look at investor-owned utilities alongside co-ops, alongside municipal power. And I don't think there's a cookie cutter solution. But I tee it up because I think people who are paying their electric bill should know the perversion that's baked into the system. And I think the solutions are all local. So co-ops have sometimes been bad actors, and co-ops are, member owned, folks in the community vote. And in some cases in the South, anecdotally, I haven't seen papers on this yet, but anecdotally, that means that people of color are squeezed out, right? Black and brown people, because they're not the powerful stakeholders in that community. So co-ops are not a panacea, and often they're locked in. And someone said this in the question and answer. Often they're locked into some of those dirty fossil fuel generation contracts because they've gotten into those agreements, and it's the cheapest way to deliver electricity to their constituents. So there is no cookie cutter perfect answer. But what I am behind and what I do care about is making sure that people have a seat at the table and making sure that they have a say in the shape of their electricity provider, because none of this is guaranteed. We have now built up an industry that is so large and that is so powerful that we sort of accept it as a given that it will be the entity and the model to move us into this transition. There are other options, and that's really what I was trying to tee up in that chapter, without answering the question for everyone everywhere.
No, fair, and I'm glad that I'm glad that's where you landed, and I think that's really helpful to sit with and to think more about that. I mean, it makes me think about some of the next few chapters where the solutions are a bit more specific and tangible, I think. But in getting there, before I turn to that, in thinking about the possible restructuring of this whole system, one of the questions that came up has asked about the energy democracy and energy justice movement that's emerged in the US over the last year. And it really, to me, sort of connects this question of the utility as a whole, as well as more local solutions that I want to ask you a bit more about. But I wanted to see if you could offer your assessment of where we are with the energy democracy and energy justice movement, and what it's done so far, and what role it will continue to play in some of the policy areas that you lay out in the book, or others.
Yeah, I'm thrilled. We have almost 200 people on this webinar. to listen to a book talk or a book conversation. And the book is called Revolutionary Power, right? I mean, we are in a moment that is transformative, and I'm excited. I'm excited. So we work routinely with partners from all over the country and the world who are engaged in this fight. And so one of the first things you and I did when we decided to start the Initiative for Energy Justice is we said, okay, well, there's all this conversation about energy justice, energy democracy. What does it mean? And so we created the Energy Justice Workbook that is a synthesis of energy democracy, energy justice, pulling from scholarship, pulling from frontline voices. And we came up with this sort of working definition that essentially means infusing equity into the energy system and making sure that the distributed benefits of the energy system are equitably distributed. And so I see so much hope right now. I just, despite the armoring of our capital, and despite all of the negative things that we've seen over the last 4 years. And here's why I'm excited. I'm excited about this book, obviously, but the struggle that I am outlining in Revolutionary Power is the same struggle that those who took to the streets to march for Black lives are marching for. And it's the same struggle that they're fighting for. We are fighting for equity across so many different dimensions and domains of our society. And I think people are finally realizing that now is the time. And it's particularly the time in the energy sector because we are reshaping the system right now. And going back to one of your earlier questions about why now, why this book, it's because it's urgent, right? I know, have worked with policymakers in Washington state around its 100% renewable portfolio standard and how to make sure that that law and that standard is equitable. States around the country are about to do the same thing. And to me, it would be a travesty if we do not use those laws and those opportunities to bake equity into the system right now. And so the struggle, the idea that we can't breathe, that cuts across the energy sector. It is absolutely, something that we should be fighting for. We can't breathe because the fossil fuel industry has been polluting our communities for so long. We are economically strapped because we have been paying too much for electricity and disproportionately high rates, not rates, but high amounts of our overall income to meet our electricity needs. And so this is a time of reckoning. And I think that we should be doing that reckoning within the energy sector. And I think the energy democracy and energy justice movements are also with me on that.
So I want to get really down to where energy, where we started. These stories about energy really connect with people's lives. And a lot of the book really does spend time in thinking about our day-to-day interaction with the reality of energy and power, more than electricity. I hope folks read the book because there's so many gems in there that I can't share, but they often begin and end each chapter. In the story about rooftop solar, I see equity being a key theme. But interestingly, not just in the way that you discuss what equity means, but also in how there's a debate, often framed by utilities, on how they frame equity in the context of rooftop solar. How do you distinguish these different approaches to equity in rooftop solar?
Okay, so this is where it's going to get a little crunchy for folks out in the audience. This is where I find rooftop solar to be one of the most technical aspects of solar policy right now. I mean, community solar is another area. So let me back up. We know, based on the incredible research of scholars such as Deborah Sunter, that there is a disparity in access to rooftop solar, even when we control for home ownership, even when we control for income. That means all things equal, communities of color simply have less access to solar. And that could be for a number of reasons. I think we need more analysis, more research to really get down into why Black and brown communities simply don't have solar. But I think we can trace it in part to some of the structural aspects of the solar transition and the design of solar access. So, right, let me give an example. So we have rooftop solar. One way to get rooftop solar is to buy it outright, right? You've got money in the bank, you want to do a good thing, or maybe you also want to save on your electricity bill. So you clear out a little bit of your savings and buy rooftop solar panels, and that gives you the opportunity to not only get some immediate returns on that investment by lowering your electricity bill, but you get an investment tax credit, which is through the federal tax code. It allows you to get some of that money back immediately in terms of your investment. So that's one way. That's great. Not everyone has money in the bank. So we have solar companies that can finance rooftop solar for people. So they go around, they go door to door. We've all seen them. They're at Home Depot, other places, and they say, hey, would you like clean energy on your roof? And so, you think it's a good thing. And so you enter into an agreement with this solar provider, and that gives you immediate savings on your electricity bill. It's not as much as in the first example, maybe it's a little bit more, but it's less than you would pay on a normal basis. The third option is that you go to the bank and you say, I want to get rooftop solar panels. Will you help me finance that? And so the bank says, yes, if you have great credit, or no, you're not a good candidate if you don't have access to great credit. So all of these things, right, are baked into our solar transition. And I would argue that they disproportionately disadvantage people of color for a lot of reasons, right? In terms of wealth, how many people of color have money in the bank just to go out and buy solar panels? We know that there's a wealth disparity in this country. With respect to solar companies coming door to door, I think, we have the diversity problem. I don't think that's actually fact. We have a diversity problem in the solar industry. So they're going to go where the fruit is lowest hanging. And those are predominantly white communities where there's already solar. There are also some studies showing that when there has been solar seeded in a particular community, meaning I see it on someone's rooftop, I think it's a possibility for me and I want to get involved. So seeding is crucial, making sure that solar makes it into communities of color. But right now we're seeing a lot of companies going into predominantly white communities and they're taking advantage of this. The third option is access to credit, right? So, for a lot of reasons, folks of color, low to moderate income people have bad credit. Bankruptcies, other types of things. So it makes them less attractive to the financing model. So that's what I mean when I say equity, and that there's an inequitable transition. On the other side of that, the utilities, the ones that you were teeing up at the beginning, are saying that solar is inequitable because the more solar goes onto people's rooftops, the fewer people are sort of paying to maintain the infrastructure of the electricity system, which also means that we're going to have to pass on the costs of maintaining our electrical infrastructure to those who can least afford it. So this is the cost shift argument. And so they now have instituted a slew of regulatory proceedings with the help of ALEC, right? So this is a conservative think tank to basically argue that solar hurts poor people. So where I would argue, where I would ask, were these same entities when we saw energy insecurity in certain homes, where people are heating their homes using ovens, where people are not able to keep the lights on, right? So where was the equity argument then? Where was the cost shift argument then? We know, we don't even have to make this up. We know based on studies that Native communities, Black communities, Latinx-led households are more likely to experience higher energy burden as well as energy insecurity. Where are the equity arguments then? And so what I would argue is that we are in a moment where we actually can widen the pathway to solar access for the communities that are bearing the worst parts of the energy system, both in terms of fossil fuel generation and in terms of costs. And we can do that now, but we've got to wrangle back this equity debate. And that means that regulators are going to have to mount up and do the hard work of figuring out how to design our energy rate structure, as well as other aspects of our energy system to ensure that it is more equitable. But we cannot buy into this very shallow, disingenuous argument that rooftop solar hurts poor people. Fossil fuel generation hurts poor people. Fossil fuel generation kills people. We need more access to solar in the communities that have borne this energy system on their backs.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you going there. I know that that wasn't going to be a simple question and a simple answer, but I'm glad that we could at least try to start grappling with that. And I appreciate that these issues are really, highlighted and discussed in the book in this balance of personal and technical terms. We're running out of time, so I want to ask.
We're not running out of time. No.
I have so many more questions I want to ask. I want to at least pull in and merge a question that I saw come up from a couple of people, and that's advice for either young scholars, college students, or young professionals who are interested in leading the energy transition, who may not see themselves as activists, but are interested in engaging in work that goes beyond climate change fundamentalism. What would your do you have any advice for those young scholars or young professionals?
Yep. Yeah. So so many things flooding through my head right now. On the scholarly front, so I have colleagues around the country who are doing this work. Tony Reams in Michigan, University of Michigan, is running an energy justice lab. Check out his scholarship, check out his work. We've got Diana Hernandez at Columbia University in New York, who's doing amazing work on energy burden. Sonia Carly, David Koninsky at Indiana University, killing it, doing amazing work on energy burden. There are scholars doing this work and engaged in these debates. So align yourself with them, follow their work. I would say to young scholars though, be courageous, be willing to ask the hard questions. Imagine what it felt like to me to go into a room filled with policymakers and veterans in the energy space and to say in a quiet voice, so what about Native Hawaiian communities, and what about people of color in this transition? And to literally have every eye in the room turn to me. I mean, you have to be courageous and believe that you are not insane as you do this work. You are not making it up. There's so much gaslighting that happens in these technical spaces, but you got to do the work, right? So then you have to dig in and do your analysis and make sure that you're on point with respect to your arguments. So be courageous, use your voice. That's another reason why I wrote this book in this way, because I wanted to make it real. I'm a human. I have a lived experience. I'm not sort of this, neutral academic, as much as we try to paint ourselves in that way. And then I would also say, there are so many organizations. I do want to shout them out. I mean, Jackie Patterson with the NAACP has created an army of folks who are energy justice experts at the local level. She's incredible. I am always on her shoulders in this work. Denise Fairchild, Emerald Cities Collaborative, again, just a wonderful person who has been in this work for so long. People like Chandra Farley at Partnership for Southern Equity in Atlanta, again, shouting them out because they have been doing this work. And of course, in California, for any of you who are doing the work there, I mean, there are just too many organizations to mention. Climate Justice Alliance, Asian Pacific Environmental Network has been fighting the fight against Chevron in Oakland for, decades. So there are places to find yourself, but the most important thing is you will not find yourself if you do not use your voice. And so trust your instincts, trust your intuition. The one thing I'll also say is that everything about our system needs to be sort of revamped. We have structural inequality. I mean, this country was founded on so many lies, and the colonization and the genocide of indigenous peoples. On that, we erected slavery and a system of capitalism that was built on extraction of labor. There's nothing that guarantees that this energy transition will be just unless we make it so. We have to do that. And so when you're thinking that you may be crazy, you're not thinking about these issues in the right way, you are, because that's the way the system was designed. But we have an opportunity to upend all of that right now.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for, supporting those voices, bringing up, raising your own, and encouraging those who are watching and and hopefully those who are with us today will, continue that support, and feel their own empowerment as well as the empowerment, and really drawing the empowerment of others. And thank you for doing that. We're coming up on needing to end. For folks who didn't get the message, there's a book out, Revolutionary Power, an activist guide to the energy transition. You can find it from Island Press or your local independent bookstore. You don't have to go in person. You probably figured out now they're delivering books, curbside pickup, whatever you need to do. You can learn more about the Initiative for Energy Justice, or IEJ as we call it, at iejusa.org. And I want to turn it to let you close and ask you one final question, Shalanda. So with this book, you've given us a playbook, joining the movement, building the voices of so many folks on what's next, on how we should tackle the energy transition in this country. So let me ask you, what's next for you?
So I want to let everyone out there know in the listening land and webinar land that starting tomorrow, I will be joining the Biden-Harris administration as the first ever Deputy Director for Energy Justice at the Department of Energy. And I will be leading the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity, transforming the DOE to be a place where energy equity and energy justice can be a part of the fabric of this country. And I am so incredibly honored to be able to carry this work, to carry the movement, to carry the work of so many scholars, to carry my father who passed away early, way too early at a young age because he grew up in an EJ community, to carry my mother who remains with us, but who struggled so much to make sure that I could be here right now. I am carrying all of that with me into this work. And Subin, I am leaving you at the helm. You are so capable, my friend. I mean, you have been a brother, you have been an interlocutor, you have been a challenger. And I just have so much faith that you're going to continue to grow and lead IEJ into this next phase. And to everyone out there, we are in a moment of transformation. So get involved, buy the book, shout me out, whatever you need to do. But let's all come together so we can make this a more just America. And so I'll end with that, but it has been a pleasure to be a part of this conversation today.
Thank you, Shalanda. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.